The Wicker Man is a cult classic British folk horror film, and yet for me as an anthropologist, it represents a unique opportunity to explore some of the cultural dynamics and how it may influence people. Today we'll be diving into some of the practices we see within the Wicker Man and trying to understand what reality is there behind them. Now, if you haven't had a chance to look at the film, I recommend you go do so, as there will be some spoilers. The film is set on the fictional Summer Isles, an isolated Scottish island with fertile farmland and thriving fruit trees. Though the Summer Isles don't exist, the film borrows heavily from inspiration from the real Scottish Isles, and the film is filmed in real locations across Scotland, leaning heavily into the feeling of isolation and detachment from the rest of Scotland and Britain. Now, the plot of the film centres around a police officer, a deeply Christian man who's dispatched to solve the case of a missing child. But from the instant he arrives on the island, everything is off. The islanders are deeply secretive, their customs bizarre, their beliefs deeply pagan, and as the officer digs deeper, he is made to think their May Day celebrations is not as joyous as it appears. His worst fears are realised when he learns the truth. The missing girl was never in danger. Instead, the islanders had led him into a trap. He is to be a sacrifice. In the final scene, the police officer is set alight alive in the prison of the Wicker Man and does a sacrifice to the island's gods. Now, this is a film, and the story does seem quite mythical, but there is some truth to the culture and historical realities that motivated the Wicker Man. For me, one of the most interesting things about the film is how it depicts the idea of cultural isolation. Now, this often happens in out-of-the-way communities, such as the one we see here in Scotland, and it's often this idea that isolation can perpetuate and preserve the unique beliefs separate from general society. Now, it's important to know some of the history about Britain and how this would have shaped the culture here. So it's historically been shaped by lots of different cultural waves, from the Britons to the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, the Viking invasions, and then obviously as an empire, colonial migration. And within it, each period brought new influences and added to the main culture here. But in some regions, especially those with natural frontiers like mountains and seas, old beliefs could survive. In fact, we see that very much today. Now, the very best examples of this are in places such as Scotland, Wales, and Cornwall. Now, these are regions in Britain where Celtic heritage, sort of the original indigenous heritage, has held true, and some of the culture and languages that predated the Anglo-Saxon England can still be witnessed here. Now, it's important to know this because the Summer Isle is a sort of fictionalised version of this, borrowing from this reality. It's a rural backwater in which paganism did not only persist, but has actually thrived and still very much being practiced during Lord Summer Isle's reign. However, it's not only been that the Celtic heritage has survived, but actually some manipulation by the grandfather of Lord Summer Isle, who brought new crops into the land. And by attributing the success of this new fruiting crop to the feet of the old gods, he was able to convince the islanders that their prosperity rested in the re-establishment of ancient rituals, including human sacrifice. Now, this gives rise to a very interesting question, particularly for me as an anthropologist. Could an isolated community, even today, be guided into believing such extreme things? And this film very much presents that possibility, that under the right circumstances, that answer would be the case. And we do unfortunately see this, particularly with cults around the world, where individuals are isolated and they get indoctrinated into very extreme cults that in the end can go on to lead to do some very horrific things to themselves and others as a result of that indoctrination. Now, the second thing I find interesting from an anthropologist perspective is the May Day celebration. The reason for this is it's both a very unsettling part, but also borrows from quite happy cultural elements from Britain. Now, I myself have English roots, however, I have also celebrated May Day. In fact, it was very much part of my culture too. And this would often involve dancing around what we call a maypole, which is essentially a pole with ribbons attached to it, and also Morris dancing, both of which are used as sort of indicators and celebration of the arriving summer, which is a time of growth and fertility and prosperity. But the Wicker Man takes these harmless customs and turns them into something far more sinister. Now, as part of the May Day celebrations, they have a parade. Firstly, these include 3 characters: the teaser, played by Lord Summerisle, the hobby horse, acted by Oak, and the fool, acted by the innkeeper. Both the teaser and the hobby horse are common costumes in folklore, but the fool is less so. The reason those characters may have been included was to represent a sort of chaos in the ritual, as all of the characters represent a sort of blurred social distinction, the teaser being both a male and a female, the hobby horse both an animal and a human, and the fool a sort of lower class as well as the upper class person, because the fool becomes the king for a day in traditional folklore. But probably the most disturbing part of the whole celebration, on top of the Wicker Man, is the fact that all the villagers are wearing animal masks. Now, the animal masks are rooted in folklore. They may represent the animal itself or sort of a connection to nature. However, in this instance, they also represent a much darker meaning. In the celebrations, though, the masks are actually far more disturbing than they see on the outset. The reason for this is that traditionally they're made to revere nature and to represent being part of nature, but in this instance it also helps to sort of repress the individuality. As all the individuals wear these masks, it's hard to distinguish one from another, and in some way they give up their sort of individual thinking and their sense of right and wrong. Another horrifying detail of these masks is their direct connection to the Wicker Man itself. If we look at the individual animals being worn by the people, you start to notice that there is a pattern, and that is that all the animal masks being worn are also animals that are trapped directly in the Wicker Man and that are being sacrificed. Now, why this is disturbing is that in many ways this is symbolic in showing that the villagers themselves could be offered up as sacrifices and would be willing participants to be in the Wicker Man. Now, this idea of the sacrifice is prevalent in ancient pagan rituals. The idea of the sacrifice, either symbolic or real, is a way of preserving well-being and order within the world. Now, where ideas such as the Wicker Man and the burning of the Wicker Man and the May Day celebrations may have borrowed from, could come from some elements of British culture. Now, although burning effigies is not a traditional part of Britain's May Day celebrations, Celtic rituals do involve fire ceremonies. One of the only examples of effigy burning in Britain is Bonfire Night, also known as Guy Fawkes Night, which only actually occurs on November 5th each year, but is commemorated by the burning of an effigy, but in more recent times has been picked up to burn things such as political figures as well, and celebrities. However, unlike the Wicker Man, it's arguably more recent political history than, say, Celtic tradition and the mysticism of Celtic tradition. Unlike the Wicker Man, however, this is grounded very much in political history rather than the Celtic sort of mysticism, and is far more recent than the Celtic belief system. The May Day festivals within the Wicker Man may have also borrowed from another festival known as Beltane, which is a Celtic fire festival celebrated on May the 1st. So this would match up with the timeline of a May Day and also involves fire. So this celebration involves the lighting of fires as a way to induce fertility, to protect livestock, and to commemorate the changing of the seasons. While Beltane does not have the practice of burning the effigy, fire itself is seen as a powerful sacred force, much like the Wicker Man. Now, what we've explored is some of the reality about the cultural elements of the Wicker Man and how some of it actually does appear in real life. I think what is most unsettling, though, about the Wicker Man is how it blurs the lines between the reality and that fantasy. It takes the sort of actual folk customs that we're familiar with and twists them into these weird horror versions of them, and actually leaves us questioning whether actually any of it could occur in real life, and would people be pushed to such extremes if they believe so. The film does not rely heavily on gore, but instead explores the power of faith and belief, the dangers of cultural isolation, and how tradition can actually justify even the most horrific deeds, and is still influential today. And it leaves us questioning, could this actually happen in real life? I'll leave that up to you. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video. I've got a number of other videos on folklore within my channel, but I thought this would be a unique opportunity to explore both culture and pop culture at the same time.